In a museum drawer, under a strip of cold white light, a rat's jaw sits on gray foam beside a paper tag gone the color of old tea. The teeth are still there. The incisors still curve forward with that familiar, troubling neatness. It is so small that you could miss it with a distracted glance. Yet someone recovered it from the packed earth of a Roman site, cleaned it, numbered it, and set it aside as evidence. For a long time, that is all such bones seemed to be evidence of, a nuisance that followed people everywhere. A scavenger. A trespasser in granaries and ships. An animal so entangled with human disgust that history flattened it into a symbol. Rats were simply there, or so the old story went, slipping through antiquity and the Middle Ages as one long, shadowy presence. But there is something strange about that jaw in the drawer. Not what it is. When it arrived. That is the detail that began to trouble the story. Because when archaeologists and geneticists started looking closely at black rat remains from ancient settlements across Europe and the Mediterranean, they were not just asking whether rats had been present. They were asking whether the rats found in Roman storehouses, harbors, wells, and towns were the same populations as those that later turned up in medieval ports and trading centers. In other words, had rats simply endured in Europe all along, as background noise to human history? Or had something much larger happened, something hidden inside the life of a creature most people only notice when it crosses the floor at night? The black rat, Rattus rattus, is not the same animal that dominates so many modern city alleys and sewers. In much of temperate Europe, that role belongs to the brown rat, which arrived later and ultimately outcompeted it. The black rat is older in the historical imagination, the agile climber of rafters, warehouses, rigging, and grain sacks, the animal often invoked, sometimes too confidently, in discussions of plague. It lived close enough to humans to travel with them, but not by any grand design of its own. Rats did not build roads. Rats did not launch ships. Rats did not organize empires. And yet, because they depended on human food, human shelter, and human movement, they became one of the most revealing witnesses we never meant to question. That is what makes the rat bone in the drawer so unsettling. It is not just a remnant of an animal. It is a fragment of infrastructure. For generations, the broad assumption seemed obvious. Black rats spread outward with trade, especially maritime trade. They were called ship rats for a reason. If they appeared in the Mediterranean world and later farther north, the simplest explanation was that they had arrived, multiplied, and remained, moving continuously along the arteries of commerce. History offered plenty of corridors for them, cargo holds, granaries, storehouses, military supply routes, ports blooming into cities, cities feeding distant frontiers. And then ancient DNA entered the room. Researchers assembled genetic material from black rat remains recovered from archaeological sites spanning the 1st to the 17th centuries, across Europe and North Africa, and compared those ancient genomes with modern data. Suddenly the old assumption could be tested rather than repeated. Bones that looked mute began to speak in patterns, lineages, clusters, breaks, replacements. What emerged was not a smooth story. It was a disappearance. The evidence suggested that black rats entered temperate Europe in a major wave linked to Roman expansion. Roman-era rats from places astonishingly far apart, Britain, Western Europe, the Balkans, grouped together genetically, as though they belonged to one vast historical event. That in itself is remarkable. It means these small animals were not drifting northward in a loose, random trickle. They were riding something coherent, the Roman world at scale. Dense settlements. Grain movement. Roads. River traffic. Maritime networks. Storage systems capable of feeding not only armies and cities, but the creatures that thrived around them. Then the pattern broke. After late antiquity, the genetic signal changes. The rats that reappear in the medieval centuries are not simply the descendants of the earlier Roman populations, carrying on quietly in cellar walls and roof spaces. They belong to a different genetic cluster. Similar animal. Similar habits. Similar closeness to people. But not the same historical population continuing uninterrupted through time. That was the answer hidden in the drawer. The jaw from the Roman site and the later remains from medieval Europe might look like evidence of one long occupation. Ancient DNA revealed instead that Europe had been colonized at least twice. The first time, black rats appear to have spread north with the Roman world. The second time, after centuries of decline or regional disappearance in temperate Europe, they returned with medieval systems of trade and urban revival. This changes more than the history of a pest. It changes the scale of what those bones are measuring. Because if rats rose with one economic order, collapsed with its fragmentation, and later returned with another, then they are not just passengers in history. They become living indicators of how connected, how provisioned, and how densely organized human societies really were. Picture the Roman Empire not as a map shaded in one color, but as a working machine. Grain shipments moving in bulk. Storage depots holding food through winter. Harbors receiving timber, oil, ceramics, textiles. Military lines consuming supply at enormous scale. Towns linked closely enough that something with no politics, no language, and no ambition beyond shelter and calories could flourish from one edge of the system to another. A black rat cannot survive in abstraction. It needs the material underside of civilization. That may be why its disappearance matters. When the Western Roman Empire broke apart, the political event was obvious enough to later chroniclers. But political collapse does not always tell us how daily connectivity changed on the ground. Ancient rat DNA offers a harsher, humbler measure. If the settlements thinned out, if storage changed, if the large, regular movements of grain and goods faltered, rat populations would feel that loss immediately. The study's authors suggest that the breakdown of Roman economic systems may have been central to the black rat's decline in temperate Europe. Other pressures may have contributed too: climatic cooling during the late antique Little Ice Age, and perhaps the first plague pandemic that began in the 6th century. Here caution matters. Rats were involved in plague history in ways still debated, and their exact role in transmission is not a settled slogan. But as ecological stress accumulated, the ancient genetic record hints that the Roman-era population did not simply persist in place. It fell away. And when rats returned in force to northern Europe, they came with a different medieval world. There is another twist, older and quieter, hiding behind this one. For a long time, people imagined the black rat's expansion largely through the romance and menace of the sea. Ships seemed the obvious vehicle. Yet the genetic evidence complicates that too. The deeper ancestry points back toward South Asia, but the route into the Mediterranean now appears more likely to have run, at least in important early stages, overland through Southwest Asia rather than simply leaping westward by maritime movement from peninsular India. Ancient and modern rats from Europe and the eastern Mediterranean share affinities with populations around Iran and the Persian Gulf more than with some of the Indian Ocean lineages one might expect if a purely maritime story explained everything. That does not banish ships from the narrative. Far from it. Rats undoubtedly traveled by sea as well, and maritime commerce remained crucial to their spread. But the older picture of the rat as merely a creature of hulls and harbors is no longer enough. Before it became a European urban shadow, the black rat may have moved through corridors of settlement and exchange stretching across Southwest Asia, following humans not just across water, but across the long, dry pathways of contact that tied one world to another. And that is where the mystery deepens into something almost philosophical. We like to imagine that the great record of civilization is written in monuments, laws, dynasties, and battles. But history is also written in what can survive inside a warehouse. In what can hide among amphorae. In what can breed behind grain sacks when transport becomes regular enough, settlement dense enough, surplus stable enough. An empire advertises itself in marble. A rat tests whether the empire is functioning. Seen that way, the black rat becomes a brutal historian. It does not care what a society says about itself. It registers logistics, climate, repetition, storage, contact. If trade routes flourish, it spreads. If towns contract and networks fail, it vanishes. If long-distance exchange revives under new powers, perhaps Carolingian systems, perhaps routes connecting Scandinavia and the East, perhaps other medieval commercial corridors, it returns. The animal is the same. The world around it is not. And there is a quiet humiliation in that realization. Human beings have spent centuries casting rats as invaders, filth, interruption, a corruption of our spaces. Yet from another angle, the rat is one of the clearest proofs that there is no strict boundary between the human world and the natural one. We build environments, and other species read them with ruthless honesty. They tell us where abundance collects. They reveal where climate ceases to be hospitable. They expose the hidden dependence of political order on grain, wood, pottery, roads, labor, ships, and crowded rooms. Even our fear of rats contains an intuition we rarely articulate. They seem sinister not only because they carry disease or damage food stores, but because they know our systems from the inside. They appear wherever our structures are vulnerable. They thrive where our waste accumulates. They move through the ducts and beams and cargo spaces that make civilization physically real. To study them is to study our own unintended architecture. That is why this ancient DNA work feels so unsettlingly powerful. It does not merely correct a zoological footnote. It reveals that the presence of black rats in Europe was not one continuous backdrop to history, but a series of arrivals bound to particular forms of human organization. The Roman rat was not simply the medieval rat with older bones. Between them lies rupture, economic change, ecological pressure, climatic uncertainty, perhaps pandemic shock, and the uneven remaking of a continent. So the old phrase, where there are humans, there are rats, turns out to be both true and not true enough. The better sentence would be this: where there are certain kinds of human worlds, certain rats can follow. And if those worlds break, the rats can disappear with them. Which brings us back to the drawer. The jaw is still there under the light, tagged and catalogued, its meaning changed. It no longer represents a timeless nuisance haunting history in one unbroken line. It marks a vanished population tied to a vanished order. Somewhere centuries later, another rat, close cousin, same species, same bright incisors, would arrive in another warehouse, under another roof, carried by another age of exchange. The bones look almost interchangeable. The worlds that produced them were not. That may be the strangest lesson of all. Not that ancient DNA told us rats came from farther away than we imagined, though in some respects it did. Not even that it showed their movements more clearly. It is that the truth of their origins was never only about the animal. It was about the civilizations that made room for it, lost that room, and made it again. If you enjoy this kind of careful journey into the hidden evidence beneath familiar history, you can stay with us for the next one. Because sometimes the smallest remains are not the margins of the story. They are where the story was waiting all along.